kind of going back through some of the parables of Jesus, I've realized that there are certain parables where we focus more on certain parts of the parables than others. And sometimes it's maybe because we're confused with how to address that part, like with the ending of the parable of the lost son. We sometimes struggle with, well, how do we deal with this older brother thing? And so we ignore that part and we focus on the first part. One of those passages that I think sometimes we focus on one part and kind of miss some of the rest of it is the parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew 18. The first part of it is I think we disconnect verses 21 and 22 from the parable that follows. And so we kind of miss part of the context of the parable to begin with. And then some of the later stuff that happens in there, I think we tend to focus more on the first part of the parable, and again, kind of neglect some of what's being said in the second half of the parable, where some of what's in the second half of that parable is every bit as important as the first part. So starting in verse 21, then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. And your verse may actually say something different there. It may go with 490, because the wording there is actually 7 times, it may be 7 times 7 or 7 plus 7, depending on, it's a little complicated as to which it's supposed to be. But either way, he's trying to give a point here that it's far more many times than what you even would imagine. And that was Jesus' point with that part. And we'll talk about that, and then we'll go on in this parable that follows is almost like another entity. But we need to remember that this is the context in which Jesus then goes and gives this parable. Is in response to what Peter says. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when the same servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, Pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt, because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? And in anger the master delivered him to the jailers, until he should pay all of his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. So there's a few points here I want to kind of highlight. And the one that we often talk about the most, I'll start there, is the unimaginable value of what this one servant owed the king. The comment in my Bible for the two monetary values being given here, the talent, for a low class worker was about 20 years' salary for one talent. And this guy owed 10,000 talents. How you get to owe that much? That doesn't really I can't compute that. And then he's owed 100 denarii, which a denarii would be 1 day's wages, basically. So for 100 denarii, that's almost a third of a year's salary. I don't care what you're making. If you owed someone a third of your year's salary, that's still significant value to owe. And so I want to go with that in terms of seeking forgiveness. The first part, where Jesus gives the answer, no, not 7 times 70, deals with how often we should forgive. But I think between the two values he's giving, there's something to how deeply we need to think about what we're willing to forgive. And I know there are things that I've heard people say, well, I could never forgive someone if they did this or that. And I'm sure we all have certain things we would struggle with. If someone were to injure or molest or kill your child, I know people who would be willing to go kill. They wouldn't be willing to forgive. Not even a couple years later, they would still hold a grudge and hate and envy or whatever towards that person and never get to the point where they could forgive them. But I think that's part of the point of the second encounter is this servant should have been willing to forgive any amount of debt, any amount of wrongdoing, because what he was forgiven was an unimaginable amount. Yes, the other was a big thing, but it still doesn't compare to a drop in the bucket versus what was owed to the king. What we would owe to God is going to be a drop in the bucket. And some of us may say, well, we don't owe that much. We haven't committed all these major sins that someone else has committed. That's true. But we still owe more than any one person is going to usually commit against us. But whatever they've committed, I think the point of this was, whatever they've committed against you, God's looking for us to be able to turn around because of what he's done for us, to be willing and able to turn around and forgive anything that's done to us, any wrong done to us. And tied in with that is the fact that because he's forgiven us, he's expecting a change in who we are and how we behave. And I think we sometimes miss that aspect of this. He is expecting a change. Our attitude, our outlook. We talked about in class our spirit. Our spirit should be changed in how we look at things because of what God has done in forgiving us. And in what he's willing to do to forgive us. And then the last thing I want to focus on there is when he finds out that this servant isn't being forgiving, hasn't changed his outlook, he takes away what he granted. The grace he had given this servant, he takes it away. Jesus gives us a very definitive answer to the question, is forgiveness once and for all? If we don't change, if we continue going on the way we were, if we continue to be ungrateful, unwilling to forgive, unwilling to love our brothers and sisters and those out there in the world, if we don't change to become more like Christ, become more like God, yes, we can lose our salvation. I think that's a very important part of what Jesus is saying here. Is yes, that can be taken back away. We can be sent to prison. He is willing to forgive us, but yes, if we don't change, if that doesn't change us, we will still end up where we were going to be to begin with. We can lose that salvation. And so, whether or not God's already forgiven us, if he's already forgiven us, we need to be working to make sure we're changing. And that's part of the story that's important, is we need to be changed. My question to you, those of us who haven't been forgiven, is where are you in that process? What are you willing to forgive, and what are you still struggling to forgive, and how can you get to where you'd be able to forgive those things? For anyone here who's not yet been forgiven by God, what's holding you back? Because we may not owe the kind of value that this servant did. I mean, I kind of get the idea of, I can't figure out how to get there, but, someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, who in his last days was supposedly came to Christ. He would be the kind of person who you could say had tallied up that kind of debt. We may not have tallied up that kind of debt, but we still owe more than we can ever on our own. Despite what these two servants said is, we'll pay you back. We can't pay God back. That's why Christ had to come. Because the only way that those debts could be forgiven is God had to pay it himself. We couldn't pay it back. So what's keeping you from coming to Christ, coming to God and pleading with him? That's what was important, is he pled. And God had mercy. When the other servant pled and he didn't have mercy, that was part of the problem. But God is a loving God, and he is merciful, and he wants to forgive our debt. If we're willing to plead with him and come to him and acknowledge, I can't. I need you to do this. He will. And we want to give you that chance to do so tonight.